We're chatting with NFL Network's Mike Silver. Got a lot of different things we want to chat with you about, including your perspective on the Chicago Bulls, covering them during the 1990s. But first, let's start with the Broncos, Michael. From your national perspective, what do you think about some of the moves they've made this offseason, especially adding some offensive weapons?
Well, I think it's exciting. You know, what they did in free agency, Melvin Gordon obviously jumps out at you. Now you can potentially get the 1-2 punch at running back with Philip Lindsay. And you know, quietly, they didn't give up a ton to get two very decorated defenders in A.J. Bouye and Jarrell Casey. The Casey trade just startled me that a player who's been that good for that long could be acquired with such little compensation. But kudos to the Broncos for figuring that out and doing it. Obviously, they've lost some familiar faces, Chris Harris Jr., Derek Wolfe, but I feel like with Vic Fangio, he has such a good understanding of what works in his very specific defensive system, which a lot of people who are brilliant offensive minds feel is the best. They feel that Vic is the best defensive strategist in the game. So I tend to trust Vic to know what he wants, and you know, even I can figure out that Jarrell Casey's been a good player for a long time, and Bouye's made a lot of plays, but I feel like Vic has a really good handle on it. And then, you know, obviously they loved what they saw in Drew Lock, and you know, whether he turns out to be as great as they believe he can or not, they made his life a lot easier on paper and made a statement really by using those first two draft picks on receivers. You know, Jerry Jeudy's as enticing a receiver as there was in the draft. It was kind of there were those three guys at the top with Ruggs and Lamb, and people had them ranked differently, but those were pretty much the top three. And then to go get KJ Hamler in the second round, and obviously, you know, with Cortland Sutton, they have a guy that they already like. So I think if you're a Bronco fan, it's exciting. If and when they do get on the field, you want to see what all that looks like.
It seems like there's going to be some extra pressure on Drew Lock now. Where do you think the Broncos are in this crazy AFC West? It seems like every team is improved, and then you got the Super Bowl champs there too.
Well, there's always pressure on Drew Lock or any quarterback who takes the field because of the history. And obviously some of that is right upstairs. And John Elway, who's one of the absolute greatest ever to play the position, a very, very short conversation as to who might be the best. And another guy, who's in that short conversation, Peyton Manning, showed up, went to 2 Super Bowls, won 1 in a Bronco uniform. So, you know, there will be pressure on Drew Lock, but, you know, it's tough to say. I mean, they are in a division with a team that won the Super Bowl dramatically and has a young quarterback, Patrick Mahomes, who looks as luminous as any young quarterback has in a long, long time. And obviously they have a lot of weapons. The Chiefs, the Chargers, coming out of 2018, look to be as talented as any team in the league. Obviously, there have been a lot of changes there since then. They're going to try with Tyrod Taylor and eventually Justin Herbert to kind of get back there. And then the Raiders like what they've done, had some flashes last year. And with the combination of the Antonio Brown fiasco and then Terrell Williams just never really, you know, being able to run like he can, they were lacking punch at the receiver position, but they've gone with the aforementioned Ruggs and some other additions. They've gone and jacked up that offense a little bit and signed some linebackers. So I think it's a really, really wide open state of affairs as to who is going to be the team that gives the Chiefs the most trouble. The Chiefs obviously prohibitive favorites, and you know, we'll see how this season plays out. Can there be games? If there are games, how many? Will it start on time and then take a break? Will it start late and then go through? But one thing I know is that there's going to be even more of a premium on division games. If games are played, the division games are going to be even more important than usual. So, you know, it's a real battle right now in the AFC West.
The NFL schedule is supposed to come out on, I think, Thursday. Have you
Yeah.
heard about what the league has, any contingency plans or anything like that?
It's such a puzzle anyway to figure that out with all the TV parameters and, concerts booked in these stadiums. So that I've seen the behind the scenes process that they go through just to come out with a schedule in normal time. So obviously it is far, far trickier now. And I think, they will probably try to backload as many division games as they can and make the contingencies that they feel are the best with the information we have. But I thought my former Sports Illustrated colleague, Peter King, made a great point this week, which is we all have to kind of just accept the premise that it might not be perfectly fair. And it never is really fair because there's always a team that says, how could you give us 3 road games in a row? Or why would you send us, on a Thursday night road game after a Sunday road game? But, it's going to be more unfair, I think, if there is a schedule that has to change. And, on the spectrum of things that we're going through as a nation and a society and a world community, it's not that big a deal. So I hope that we can all kind of just accept the fact that there are going to be some potential inequities.
Yeah, gonna have to go safety first there. You've known John Elway for such a long time, dating way back to his playing days. What do you think about the way that he is running a franchise now? Obviously has that competitive spirit.
Well, listen, he and I both spent a lot of time in an earlier era where there was, for a while, no salary cap, where aggressive owners were rewarded with, at least better rosters usually. And I certainly covered those Bronco teams once I got to SI and before with Pat Bowlen, another great owner. And so we, I think, have different mentalities a lot of times than people who've come out of later eras. And John, to his credit, has enunciated it many times to me and to other people. And that is, I believe we should be competing for the Super Bowl every single year. And a lot of people would say, well, that's just not possible. You can't do that. And it may not be, but I love the fact that John not only believes it, but, strives for it. And so, yeah, it's tough. It's a lot of pressure when the Broncos are not doing that. It's going to be an uncomfortable feeling in that building and in that community. So, look, he did an incredible job to, come in, make them relevant early, made an amazing move to get Peyton Manning that changed a lot of things, fired a coach coming off a very, very successful season, John Fox. And some of the moves since then have not worked out the way John wanted. And, he's made some draft picks that people have questioned, but I don't think anything's changed. You can't be right all the time, but I think the mentality is the right one. He's got a great personnel department with Matt Russell running things over there. Vic Fangio was an interesting hire because it was not the shiny box. You're not going to win the press conference, but people who really know football, including some of these brilliant young offensive coaches that are the toast of the league and that everybody wants to have. You ask them privately, they'll say, I hate facing Vic Fangio's defense. And when Vic was hired, to me, I thought, like Bruce Arians or Mike Zimmer, it could have been one of those hires where just a really, really good coach for a long time who's not, a trendy head coaching candidate might end up being the best hire. So I'm really anxious to see what Vic Fangio does in year 2.
You mentioned your SI days there. You're known for these great behind the scenes, all access types of stories. Anything you could share from your time with John?
Oh, sure. Listen, John and I, went to rival colleges and, we remind each other of that a lot. But, I grew up in LA a few years behind him, and I knew how great he was in high school in 2 sports. And I remember going to I did actually have one close friend who went to Stanford, unfortunately. And I remember going to a frat party early on with him and John, whose eligibility was up, but who hadn't yet left for Denver, was at the frat party, and it wasn't that big a party. And I just remember looking over and going, man, that's John Elway. It's a pretty big deal. I got to cover Joe Montana every day. I got to cover John Elway and Dan Marino. I couldn't have been more thrilled that they not only were among the greatest of all time, but they were the best dudes, and they understood what sports writers did, and certainly once I got to Sports Illustrated, they understood the power of that, and they really trusted me a lot. John had me over at his house with his family once, and kind of let me know after the fact. By the way, I've never done that before. You're the first person I've let through the door, and I didn't take it lightly. And I got to cover the 2 Super Bowls. It was just such a cool story. So I'll give you a couple of scenes. The Broncos win that first Super Bowl, and just as you saw with Andy Reid this year, the football community was so happy for Andy Reid. Well, when John Elway got that Super Bowl championship after the 3 defeats, everybody who wasn't, who was in any way neutral was super pumped for him. And one of the great things was that I was at the Pro Bowl, which was a week later in Hawaii, its rightful place. And I was with some friends, a couple of players who weren't in the game, and a couple other people. And we're at Duke's, the legendary happy hour spot on Waikiki Beach. Our feet are in the sand. It's a happy hour scene. It's maybe Tuesday, and John and Mike had flown in late, and I think they had just gotten to Hawaii, probably straight from the airport. And all of a sudden, John and Mike are walking up to our little beachside table and sitting down, and everybody wanted to hug John or slap John's hand, strangers, and so I think Mike eventually left because he had to get to work, but John, or maybe he had to do something else, but John stayed, and we sat there for hours. And I just remember another round of beers and another round of sashimi magically showing up at the table every few minutes, and John was as happy as I've ever seen a player, and just basking in the glow. And then the next year, getting to cover what turned out to be his last game, MVP performance against Dan Reeves. I mean, a storybook again. And long after the game, he and his wife Janet were the last ones at the stadium. I got to ride in the limo back to the hotel, and then it's just me and John up on the balcony, and he's smoking a cigar, drinking a beer, and looking down in the rain on Fort Lauderdale, and it's all sinking in. And I just, at Sports Illustrated, we look for access, and we look for great scene leads, and there were some famous ones. But in that moment, I'm thinking, all right, man, this is as good of a scene lead as anyone's ever going to get. Now, don't mess this up. You've got all night to write it. Do not screw this up, because it's pretty much, all laid out for you. So, yeah, I mean, I had a blast covering John, and it was just incredible to me that the greatest players, the most impactful players, not just of that era, but right on that list of the best in the history of the sport, and your Montanas and your Elways and Marinos were also, in my opinion, the people who were easiest to cover.
You mentioned that being his last game. What do you think the sporting world lost that year, 1999, when John Elway and Michael Jordan both retired the same year?
A lot. And with Jordan, it was rough because it was his second retirement, and the first one blessedly did not last. But yeah, I mean, that was a lot. You can't write the history of those eras without either guy. They were larger than life figures on and off the field, and really just I could go on for hours and hours and hours about the athleticism and the incredible things they did, but really what those two people have in their DNA, which only the greatest of competitors have, is that insane maniacal drive, and it manifests differently. Michael was, as people are seeing now with The Last Dance, he was all over people and, humorless and just couldn't turn it off, and had his moments, but pretty much was always trying to win every single thing he did at all times, and that permeated. With John, I think there was that type of competitiveness, but he also was able to, take the guys out and have a few beers and be as much, seem like an offensive lineman instead of a guy who had to be the center of attention and suck the air out of the room. And he was a guy who could, manage, like Montana, to be of the people, even though everybody on some level knew, that guest room we just built or that vacation home we're buying, it's pretty much traceable to number 7's, genius. So I just thought with John, what people missed, I think, about his career that I got to see a little of, and that, Greek and the medical people in the Broncos facility understand most of all, is that his toughness was beyond reason. And when he retired, you knew he was banged up, because that guy played through things that I don't think people understand. And Steve Antonopoulos did lay it out for me one time, kind of, and I just remember sitting there with my mouth open, just like I never knew. And there are three kinds of players. There are guys who aren't as tough for whatever reason, or maybe they're finely tuned sports cars and their body has to be just right. There's super tough guys, but they got to let you know. A certain quarterback in Pittsburgh who's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer, who's one of the best I've ever seen, may or may not fall into that drama queen category. He is tough. There is no doubting that Ben Roethlisberger is very, very tough, but he doesn't mind if you know how tough he was. And then there's the third kind, which is they're the toughest guys and you don't really know. And that was John.
Yeah, we can tell now the way he walks around the facility a little bit. You could see it.
Well, he walked like that even for years. Even when he was the fastest guy on the field, he still walked weird.
Pigeon-toed a little bit, yeah. Is there anybody in the NFL who reminds you of Michael Jordan? I mean, sometimes you hear like a Peyton Manning kind of a name thrown around.
I mean, to me, Jerry Rice was the most like that, and I covered him daily. But just now that he's been away from it for a little bit, he and I have a really good relationship and we can kind of joke around. But day to day, there were times where I thought we were joking around or saying something sarcastic or having a conversation where it couldn't possibly be perceived as literal, like a photo that showed when I was doing a story running the hills with Roger Craig and Jerry Rice that I was ahead of Jerry Rice by a decent margin. I mean, we both knew that was an optical illusion, and that, he ran down that hill a million times faster than me, and that not only do I know that and he knows that, but everyone in the world knows. But you think you were just goofing around, and he would just all of a sudden be like fighting mad. And, so to me, that is the closest parallel I've seen to just the maniacal intensity all the time, and it translated into incredible performances too.
It seems like the whole sports world is captivated by The Last Dance. It must be unique for you to watch it. I mean, what's it like? Is it accurate?
Well, yeah, I think it's pretty accurate. And as someone who spent a lot of time with Dennis Rodman, did a book with him, did Sports Illustrated stories for him, went out a lot with him till the sun came up, and in very conspicuous ways. I guess my first note, and I experienced this with the Rodman 30 for 32, and I was interviewed a bunch for that, but I keep marveling that there's not footage of us that seems to exist, because we weren't hiding. We were all out and conspicuous in big crowded places, acting the fools and not really worrying about it. And it was a different era. There were obviously no cell phone cameras. So part of me thinks, like, am I going to see some footage at some point where, like, we're going through Crowbar in Chicago and, and then part of me thinks, well, maybe it's better if we don't.
You spent so much time with Rodman. There was one line that really stuck out from that cover story. You said he's a man drunk on his own ability to do whatever he wants, a rebel without a boss. That's a great line. I mean, what made Rodman tick?
Well, first of all, I think it's amazing that I wrote that line at 4 in the morning, wild, exotic birds chirping, and I think a lot of people thought it was just a clown show, or that he was somehow just trying to make money off it, and certainly having had a relationship with Madonna, he understood the power of from a marketing perspective of doing those things publicly. But I think maybe one of the things that got lost was just how poking fun at social conventions and kind of throwing it in people's face like that, how important that was to him in and of itself. And honestly, I was there when a lot of these things got dreamed up. It wasn't some grand marketing plan. It was a bunch of punch-drunk people at breakfast sitting around going, "Oh, bro, what if I put on a wedding dress? Oh, people will freak out," But what people also need to understand is that it was a different time in society. There was a lot less tolerance. He was a guy who felt weird inside and was scared to show that. And then once he let it out, he was shocked that instead of getting only negative feedback, there were a lot of people in society really warmed to him and felt like he was speaking for them, and specifically the gay community, the LGBTQ community, what we would call it now. Not sure what we were even calling it then. And people who had some gender fluidity, all those people really felt a strong kinship for him, and it meant a lot to him to be able to speak for those people and try to give them a voice, or give their feelings a voice. And so it just he had an incredible amount of fun. I know I was there for a lot of it, but there was also some genius behind it that maybe gets lost a little bit.
Most definitely. I think we're all waiting to see how the final 4 episodes wrap up. We appreciate your time joining us here, and hope you stay safe, and hopefully there's an NFL season.